Hi, I'm Brett from papercartridges.com here with my sleepy buddy Willie. You want to say hi? Say hi, Willie. He is just gonna go lay down and take a nap while we do a really nerdy deep dive into some obscure areas of Enfield rifle musket ammunition. Last video was shooting volleys with a bunch of friends on the range at 300 yards, and this is probably going to be a lot less exciting. So I doubt this is going to get hundreds of thousands of views, but it's stuff that interests me. And if you enjoy these nerdy deep dives, then hopefully this stuff will interest you. And what we're going to talk about today, is there any difference in accuracy shooting Enfield cartridges that have plugs made out of kiln-fired clay or plugs that are made out of an epoxy resin? And for a very, very brief background, again, I want to keep this fairly short. Not all rifle musket bullets needed plugs. The American Burton bullet, Civil War bullet, never used a plug. The British did keep the plug, though, because it enabled them to specialize their ammunition for the battlefield and not necessarily for the target range. So that plug acts as a mechanical assist, a wedge action, and it enables you to make the bullet for the rifle a lot smaller in size. That means you can load it a lot easier and faster. So on a battlefield, when you're less concerned about shooting clover leaf size groups and you're more concerned about putting sustained effective fire in the general area of the enemy, British conclusion was we're going to make the bullet smaller, much smaller. So it's a 0.55 inch bullet. So a 550 caliber bullet going down a 5.77 caliber bore. So there's 27 thousandths of windage between the bullet and the bore. While the American Civil War bullet, you have about 2 thousandths of an inch with the Burton Mini. So the British appreciated this system. It's not as accurate, but it let them fire, sustained fire for longer. It's much easier for the soldiers to load, especially after these guns start to get fouled up a little bit. And they originally used boxwood for their plugs, and boxwood is very dense, very hard. They used it because you can ship it all over the world, and the wood is less susceptible to swelling or shrinking in different climate conditions. But it was so expensive that by the 1850s, they had to make a choice between performance and cost. So they went with a kiln-fired clay plug, and use that throughout the rest of the service life of not just the Enfield, but also through all of the marks of Snyder ammunition. In fact, they all use the same clay plug. But for the nerds among us who still shoot the Enfield rifle with the Enfield cartridge with a plug, most of us don't use wood because you essentially have to turn your plugs almost one at a time, or pay a company to make you a massive run of them up front with a pretty large upfront cost. So it's out of the practical realm for most of us. So what most of us do is we make the plugs out of a epoxy. So like either a modeling clay, like a Sculpey brand modeling clay, which is cured in the oven, or like a two-part epoxy resin. Some people make it out of Bondo, the automotive filler. I like a brand called Magic Sculpt, and there's a video already on the channel. I'll try to remember to link to it in the description, where I do the famous patented Gibbons procedure for making these plugs out of epoxy. But we shoot them today, modern shooters, historical shooters, and I've wondered, is there a difference? Because I make both varieties, or at least I have plugs with the 550 caliber bullet, plugs with the clay, and plugs with the epoxy. And I thought, is there any practical difference? And I figured if I'm going to go shoot a comparison, then maybe you'd like to see it too. So here we are. So is there a difference? So simple plan. up to the state game lands range. This was several months ago. It's early February now. It's cold and icy out there, but you'll see in the video it was still green and warm last fall when I actually did the shoot. But 10 rounds of each type of plug. So 10 rounds of the clay plugs, kiln-fired clay plugs that my friend Steve Sheldon made me. And then 10 rounds of the two-part epoxy, the Magic Sculpt epoxy at 100 yards. Now in this test, one possible asterisk that may come back and bite me a little later, as you'll see, I'm using Kick brand powder. So Kick is no longer in production. It used to be made in Slovenia. I liked it. Some people thought it was dirty, but it was cheap. So like 10, 12 years ago when I was out in the West Coast shooting out in the desert, I mean, it was $7 a pound, so it was cheap. It worked well enough. I ran out of Swiss, so several months ago, I had Kick, so I used what I had. Now, to preface this, before we get into the shooting, and I might actually throw some range video in the background so that we can save time, because you don't need to watch me stand up and load and fire a musket 20 times for this video. But to preface the results, they're going to be horrid by most standards. What I mean by that, we're doing what we call historical shooting, and I'll get a little bit more into historical shooting towards the end, and briefly mention my friend Hugh's book on historical shooting with the Enfield rifle. But there's historical shooting where what we want to do is shoot these 19th century arms the same way that they were being shot when they were new, when they were in actual military service. This is opposed to target shooting, which is like a related hobby, but that's where you're trying to get these guns to shoot the tightest possible group size. So we're trying to squeeze the maximum amount of accuracy with them. And usually that means you have to work up a load. Like you're not going to start with the military bullet and the military service charge and call it a target load. It wasn't then, it obviously isn't now either. But I know people who've carefully worked up loads, like North-South Skirmish Association shooters, who can take these original guns or reproductions and get them to shoot a 3-inch group at 50, sometimes even out to 100 yards. It's breathtaking. But that requires a lot of trial and error and finding out exactly what bullet size, weight, and what powder size, weight works for that gun. So it's not the military service charge. What I like to do in historical shooting is take the original historic ammunition and see what the guns can do. The results are often not very flattering because, again, this ammunition by design was meant for a battlefield. It was not intended for a target range. So you'll see these groups, and for someone who shoots bench rest shooting with a rifle-musket or anyone North-South Skirmish Association, it's going to be appalling. Like, holy cow, those are those are massive groups, terrible shooting. But for historical shooting, that's okay because that's how it was then, or at least that's my goal, is to shoot the way it was then. It's not for everyone, and that's okay. If you prefer target shooting, making them to shoot accurate, you know, power to you. It's probably harder to do that than it is to do the historic round. But anyway, the results, I guess we can wade into them. And they were worse than I expected to. I did expect some tighter groups. It might possibly be because I was using that Kick brand powder instead of my beloved Swiss. So possibly I'll shoot it again and see if I can get better results. I may or may not. But I'm using the figure of merit method to measure these results using Rob's excellent free figure of merit calculator, which is just the mean radial deviation. And the clay plug, again, fired 10 rounds. One of those rounds was unaccounted for. Even watching the video footage, I couldn't see where it went. So there's 9 rounds on the target and one flew into the ether somewhere. And out of those 9 that I could account for, the figure of merit was 5.31 inches. So that is to say, from the mathematical calculated center of that group, the average bullet impacted 5.31 inches away from the mathematical center. So this isn't the same as a group size. Group size is embarrassingly huge, but the figure of merit measures the consistency and not just the distance between your farthest away shot. So it's more useful for stuff like this. And you can see there's a cluster kind of in the center where 6 out of the 10, or 6 out of the 9 that were accounted for, are in about a 7-inch group. So if you want to measure it by a group, 2/3 of the accounted for bullets end up in about a 7-inch group, which is a little more respectable. And in both the clay and the epoxy groups, you see there's like a center cluster, and then there's hits all the way around. And I can't account for that. So the epoxy counted all 10. We did manage to at least hit the target and see where they go with all 10. The figure of merit for the epoxy group's a little bit larger, but keep in mind there's 10 shots instead of 9, but it's 6.52 inches. And there's 2 out of that group that pulled pretty far to the left. If you remove those 2, the figure of merit for the epoxy plugs would be considerably better. And if we remove one of them, if we take the best 9 out of each, because that's the only ones that hit on the clay, the epoxy would have a tighter overall group. So with the epoxy, again, 6 out of the 10 were within a 6-inch wide group. And fortunately, because I put the other camera through the spotting scope and I can watch the bullets into the target, we can see where 2 actually went through the same hole. So that wouldn't have been accounted for. I would have probably assumed it missed if we didn't have the video. So the takeaway, bottom line, which is better? I would give a slight edge to the epoxy, although they're both close enough that it's probably safer to say that the epoxy shooting better was more a fluke than anything out of superiority of the epoxy plug. So close enough to be, if you asked me, I didn't see a whole heck of a lot of difference. In fact, they both shot considerably worse than what I was expecting. That could have been the kick powder. It could have been me. What are you doing, Willie? I'm doing a video, buddy. But they're close enough for all practical purposes that you could almost call them equal. In fact, I would say that they were equal. What I want to do next is take that epoxy plug bullet and test it against the bullets with the wooden plug. Now my theory, and I'll put this out here now, I might prove myself wrong when I do it. The theory is that the wooden plugs will perform better because the wood compresses. You want the wood to be hard enough that it still has that wedge action and it can force the lead at the skirt of the bullet to flare out a lot. Again, 27 thousandths of windage is, you got to expand that bullet a lot to engage rifling. But you also want the plug, my theory, you want it to keep moving up and bottom out, so to speak, inside the base of the hollow bullet, so that the entire skirt is forced out, so that more of the bearing surface of the bullet expands and grips the rifling instead of just the very base. So with the harder plugs, with the kiln-fired clay and with the epoxy, the bullet bottom, it cannot go all the way up to the top of the bullet cavity because the plug is just too hard. So its movement forward is forcibly stopped before it moves very far. And I'll do some close-ups of the bullets that I've recovered, and you can see the difference between how much farther the wooden plugs move compared to the clay and the epoxy. So that's my prediction. I might prove myself wrong again. I will use Swiss on the next test, and fingers crossed that I get some better results. But very quickly, before we call it a day on this quick, informal, nerdy deep dive, wanted to mention my friend Hugh's book, Historical Shooting with the P1853 Enfield, and it bears relation to this video because, again, this is historical shooting, and he goes into a lot of detail in this on using the figure of merit to measure your shooting and on how to make the ammunition and the plugs. So for instance, he's got instructions on how he makes his plugs. Hugh has no idea I'm doing this with his book, by the way. So this is an unsolicited pitch, I guess you could say, for historical shooting with the Enfield rifle. So Hugh has no idea I'm doing this. He didn't pay me. I'm getting absolutely nothing out of it. But I really enjoy historical shooting. It's unfortunately, most people who shoot these rifles don't want to shoot them with the historical ammo, and it could kind of frustrate me, but I get it. Who wants to go to the range and shoot, 24-inch groups? So if you want to shoot a little better, you can tinker with the bullets. But I enjoy the historical shooting. I'll put a link to where you can pick up Hugh's book. I show you more of it, but I got a dachshund in my lap. Yeah. Are you bored? Well, I better take him for a walk. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Again, a very, very down and dirty, informal deep dive into clay plugs for Enfield rifle musket bullets. Good grief. We are nerds. If you watched this long, appreciate you sticking around. Hope it was useful, and I will see you next time.